Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Right. I'm Andrew Molyneux, one of the founding directors alongside Harry Triggs, who's there at the back with the grizzly beard. And we're delighted to welcome you to TM Lighting and to this event this evening. As you may or may not know, we work across all sectors, or TM Lighting works across all sectors, from museums, private residences, contemporary galleries, advising on how to light art, and we manufacture everything next door. We're really excited to launch the Apollo's Talks program this autumn. As you know, Apollo wasn't just the god of culture and art, but also of light. There we go. So it's a fitting symbol for what this talk series is all about, and bring light not only to the art but also to the stories behind and voices behind it. So tonight we're thrilled to welcome Nicole Wassall. Sorry, Nicole. We're thrilled to welcome Nicole, and it's presented by Firmano Class Gallery, and there is Francesca right there if you want to chat to her later. So she'll be in conversation with Arjun Sajip, web editor at Apollo, who will explore the ideas, processes, and the journey behind her work. A heartfelt thanks to Ed Behrens and Kath Boone. Thank you, guys. Thanks so much for making this collaboration possible. Apollo is a great magazine. There's a few over there if anyone wants to grab one at the end. And I'm sure they'd love some subscribers as well if you don't already subscribe. Great plug. Also, while we're plugging away, Art SVP have been great to support our guest list and been invaluable, and it really comes highly recommended if you need that sort of tech. So this is just the beginning. During Freeze Week, we'll be hosting another talk in the series on the 16th of October, where Arjun will be in discussion with Ella Brill, and this will be presented by MT Art Agency. We're really excited to keep building these conversations on and a unique dialogue between art and light. So a quick word about the gallery. It's a not-for-profit space that supports mid-career artists. We offer a platform for private views, events, and talks just like this one. We have about 5 artists a year, and we'd love to keep you informed, so do sign up to the newsletter or have a chat with one of the team, Harry, myself, Matt, or Ella. Matt, where are you? He's gone. There he is there. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Arjun and to leave the discussion with Nicole.
Thank you very much for the intro, Andrew. So we are in conversation with Nicole Wassall, who over the years has developed a practice that encompasses a remarkably wide range of mediums: painting, etching, sculpture, installation, photography, video work, and the list doesn't even end there. Art history and the workings of the mind, themes that she's returned to again and again in her work. But despite the scope and the sweep of these themes, her art is always inviting rather than imposing. And we can see examples of it beautifully lit all around us. So tonight we're going to find out a little bit more about the artistry behind the work. So without further ado, let's begin at the beginning. So, Nicole, what is your first memory of being really moved by a piece of art?
I think, to be honest, I was very little, and it wasn't a piece of art. It came about because my mum was an antique dealer, and she used to take me to a lot of auctions in the Midlands, and a lot of them were quite grotty and dirty, and there was lots of terrible furniture that was broken and awful. But in the midst of all of that, I found Art Nouveau, and I just thought it was amazing. You could imagine a 4 or 5-year-old child just like going, oh, what elves made this stuff, you know? And it felt otherworldly to me. And it opened my mind up. And I mean, if you're in auction houses for a long time as a young child and you're not allowed to touch, then it can be a bit boring. So seeing these beautiful things, and there weren't that many, but they were candlesticks, and they were tables, and they were chairs, and they were paintings, all these different things, and they were otherworldly. And I think in that way it's possibly why with my own practice I don't focus on paintings, which so many artists do, but I see that opening up in such an innocent way at that age, happening with so many different things, is probably why I have so many different objects and wands and spiders' webs and, different things in my practice.
And it obviously set you on a path to kind of explore art more and study it formally at Central St Martin's. You did an MA in fine art there. What did you learn there that kind of went on to shape your practice? Was there anything in particular, any kind of formative experiences or? There
were a lot of experiences at St Martin's. I'm not going to tell you about many of them. And I came to art late, not because I wanted to come to art late, but there were quite a few barriers in my way to kind of get to art. So I ended up studying at St Martin's as a mature age student. And I hadn't studied art A-level, or I was in Australia, so it would have been HSC. So that had made it difficult for me to get into art school. But as a mature age student, having done weekend courses and having a portfolio and all this sort of thing, I was able to get in. And they were quite good like that. They were happy to take risks with people. And on foundation, it's not a huge risk, but it's quite a hard foundation to get into. And I had this wonderful art tutor, James Swinson, and he was the first person to sort of start a message that went through. And he told me to embrace my scruffiness, which was really appropriate because I'd been working as a consultant and I'd had to be quite buttoned up and tight. And that was sort of the start. And then when I was on the MA, I had a gorgeous critical framework tutor, Dr. Kate Love. And she used to talk to me. When she talked to me, she'd kind of like lean forward and she'd have like a little, knot in her brow. And then one day she just leaned back and her whole face opened up. I said, I've got it. Now I understand you. Now I understand your practice. And she said, you're kind of an anarchist. And I kind of thought, I'm not sure. And then she explained what she meant. And she was right. So there will be something in life that I see, like some kind of punctum, if you know what I mean, like something that's like a hook. And I'll not be able to stop looking at it and trying to work out what it's about. And then I'll start researching it. And you kind of go to these things with your own views. And then I will, invariably, then you find the opposing argument. And then you find other things. And then what I do is I absolutely rip everything up. And that's what she meant by anarchist. So I rip everything up, rip all the ideas up, and then I come up with something new and fresh. And I'm kind of looking for something that underneath all of this mound of information it feels like a truth, something quite honest. And so that was Kate. And then also there were the students as well. Your peers are really important. And I studied with someone called Robert Carey-Williams, who's an amazing creative. And I got many pearls of wisdom off him. But one I'll bring up because Bernard Cage is here. Francesca will be able to vouch that I can be slightly annoying on a show and that I want the walls to be absolutely perfect. And I was exactly the same on my MA. And so everyone else had like taped the walls and painted them. I had filled them and sanded them and polished them and filled them and sanded them and painted them and the whole lot. And so it was all looking beautiful and I thought it looked great. And then Robert came in, he just shook his head and he said no. And I was sort of... And he pointed up to the projector. And I'd done what every other art student did, and that I had these long screws coming down with these bolts at the bottom of the platform, with the DVD and the projector on the top, and it was projecting. He said, you can see the cables. He said, and that's fine for other artists, but you can't do that. That's not okay with your work because it has to be clean because of the way I simplify everything. To have something like that visible detracts from your work. So with Robert and with Kate and with James, it was all this idea about finding my voice and encouraging that voice and justifying and verifying it and making me feel better about it. And it was interesting when I was doing the lighting here. So Matt, I kind of, because also Robert knew I can be a little bit shy sometimes. And so he gave me the confidence when I was chatting to you and you were lovely because he would say, how about the lighting like this? I go, can we go down a bit? And then it was like, yeah, no, I think you're right, maybe go up a bit. But you let me do that. And that was an important part of the process. And it was clear working with you that you understood that was an important part of the process. And you made me feel very comfortable about that. So that was rather cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all the different kinds of art that you make, do you all make it in a studio, in one studio? And if so, could you tell us a bit about your studio routine, where it is, what it's like?
I have a poor flat, that is my studio. And so when I moved in, I had this plan of having a lounge, and I had this dream of a velvet settee, which I've never had because it's a studio. But I do have a chandelier in my studio, which I inherited off my grandmother, so that's rather nice. The lighting's very good in the studio, a lot of light. But more seriously, the space is very dynamic. Sometimes I'm doing very, very clean work, so it has to be absolutely spotless. So if I'm doing water gilding or oil gilding, there can be no dust. But if I'm making the gesso, there's a lot of dust and it's messy. And if I'm making plinths or I'm making other things, I also do sort of metal smithing at home, and I have a Black & Decker thing that I attach floorboards to, and I make my little workstation, and then I had the landing, and there was some spare space there. And then last show I did, I had to learn how to etch. So then I raided the Habitat catalogue, and I kind of made myself a workstation sort of with bits of, DIY furniture, but I just didn't follow the instructions. I did what I wanted to do. And so I have this lovely space there. And then obviously occasionally the kitchen gets drawn into it, but I try and stay out of the kitchen as much as possible. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll be talking more shortly about the gesso and the water gilding, because that's certainly a big part of your work. But before we start talking about the process, I'd like to talk maybe about some of the themes in your work, because they're unusual and also quite specific in some ways. Neuroscience and also psychology, and specifically confirmation bias, is something that you've long been interested in.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit perhaps about how you explore these themes in your work?
Yeah. So the neuroscience bit, I will separate from the psychology. The neuroscience, quite excitingly, my dad sent me this amazing article from New Scientist about the political brain. And it was talking about confirmation bias and how that worked and what is actually going on in the brain when that's happening. And I'd used that in my consultancy practice to change the way I did things. And it had had a very significant impact. So when I started studying art more seriously, then I started looking to neuroscience, and I discovered this wonderful scientist, Ziki, who was fascinated by art. It was a natural interest for him. And at that stage with neuroscience, I didn't really know what to research, didn't know what to look at. But because he had an interest in art, he knew about the Fauvists, who very famously could feel things happening in their head when they used the wrong colour. So they would, for example, paint a blue strawberry. And then through fMRI scans, you could see that if you see a blue strawberry rather than a red strawberry, you get recognised, categorised parts of the brain light up. You just change the colour to blue, the brain just doesn't know what to do. Now, in terms of confirmation bias, which is a clear issue, then if you can get out of that recognised, categorised part of the brain, or if you can avoid the emotional reaction, the emotional block part of the brain, and get into a different part, which is more curious and more trying to work things out, then you can have a very different discussion. Your work can do something very different. So with the neuroscience, it's not a theme as such that I try and demonstrate neuroscience, but it is a tool in the same way as another artist would use a paintbrush or a palette knife or a scalpel or something like that. And so whilst when I started, I was much more deliberate, did a lot of research on neuroscience, the different things I could learn, so how I could use those. And what it helped me to do was sort of almost coach and train my own brain so that I can feel when something a bit different's happening. So short of getting an fMRI scanning machine, that it's more intuitive and more implicit in the way I use it now. And it's much more, it's just another brush that I'm using. It's not, whereas with the psychology, because I'm interested in the nature of things and in life and how the world works and how people work within that world, then obviously psychology is helpful. And I started going to a lot of lectures, Jung and Freud, and analysing paintings at the Freud Museum and that kind of thing. And also Central St Martin's had an evening programme of Jungian case studies. And it did change the way I think and the way I think about things. And so that was very helpful in my practice at a different way. And I think the confirmation bias kind of flicks into those two, particularly into neuroscience.
Are there any examples of artworks in this room that you could sort of talk about how those themes are expressed?
Okay, so if we think about neuroscience first, so with the bird in the cage story, because it's blaringly in my eyes, I can see it. By writing a story, or actually the original time it was shown on my MA, and also Francesca shown it like this, I projected it with honeysuckle oil. Now, I couldn't really do that in this space because space is too big. But in smaller, more discrete spaces, you can use honeysuckle oil. And the beautiful thing about that, this goes back to like Proust and the Madeleine cakes. So we know from neuroscience that the part of the brain that deals with scent is not only right next door to the part of the brain that deals with long-term memory, but they actually cross over. And that's why you have that thing when you go on holiday and you're having a lovely holiday in Hawaii because you're glamorous, and then someone walks past and it's like, oh, now I remember that holiday in Bognor Regis, and it's just that different memory you're taken straight there. And so I wanted to do the story is a little nostalgic, and I wanted to do something that felt nostalgic. And when I researched it, I found that honeysuckle across the world seems to be a nostalgic smell. And every time I played the video with the honeysuckle, 2, 3, 4 people come up to go, so nostalgic. It's so nostalgic. But when I play it without the honeysuckle, no one ever mentions nostalgia. So it is a really interesting way. So that's sort of like a neuroscience bit.
Okay, no, that's really useful to kind of have an example there. Thanks. You've also said, I'm going to throw one of your own quotes back at you. You've said that your work is primarily concerned with unpicking social constructs that seem unhelpful. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, and helpfully, that's also almost the other side of the coin of confirmation bias. So maybe it's, because I'm guessing that you're going to ask me to come up with an example, yeah? So I'll go straight to the example. So if you go to something like Pope Joan, there are...
So Pope Joan is just the one over there with the lady in red.
Yes. And now I've got Krista Bergson in my head. Nightmare. So Pope Joan, she educated a woman, and she wanted to learn more. She had a boyfriend. They decided to go to Rome. The only way she could really get educated was to join the church and pretend she was a man. And she was very intelligent, did very well, and she sort of got up the ladder and became Pope. Unfortunately, whilst she was going to procession down the Via Sacra, she gave birth. And that was kind of slightly revealing of the fact that she was actually a woman, not a man. And sadly, because of that, she died. And so you can see sort of the ridiculousness of that within that piece. And by having it in there like that, I think most women here, and quite a lot of men are educated on these things now as well, will understand that a lot of the issues she was contending with, we also contend with, probably not quite as severe, but it's there, and it is that confirmation bias, the reasons why women can't be in these positions that aren't real. That sort of, does that make sense?
Yeah. And also, I mean, that leads us quite neatly onto process, because that's a work that features some trademarks of your practice. It's made with tempera, with black bowl, and it uses water gilding around the frame. And so it's an intriguing work partly for those reasons as well as thematically. So first of all, what made you want to depict it in that specific way that you have with the kind of icon board? And also there's a hole at the centre of that. Could you explain or elaborate?
Specifically, I wanted to picture her with an icon board because that is the traditional way of depicting saints. And I kind of thought she was quite cool, and I thought she deserved that, to be canonised. And I thought, who better to canonise her than a female artist, And the beautiful thing about icons is there's so much tradition within them and how they're made. And so the actual icon board came from the same place that supplies the Vatican. And the sort of the things which are kind of traditional in icon painting. So, for example, her head's at the side. You can see her ear. This is so she can hear your prayers. And there's another thing with icons, that the saint should glow. It should look like it's glowing. And the traditional way of doing that can look a bit funny, especially when the icon gets a bit old, like they haven't just quite got the material right. And it's because they're not trying to depict the material. They're trying to depict the fact that it's glowing. And knowing quite a lot about colour, despite the fact I don't generally use it, I know how to make things glow and look three-dimensional. So I used red and blue because obviously the blue is the divinity, heavenly, Virgin Mary, all of that stuff. And then the red is passion, is martyrdom, is blood, all that sort of symbolism. And having the two together, you can really see she's popping out and she's really strong in colour. Now, one decision I made with the sky, so with icon paintings, usually the whole icon is painted, everything is covered. But here the sky is just gesso. And the reason for that is whilst a pale blue sky, believe me, should have looked even better, and she really would have popped and it would have looked really three-dimensional. I was so tempted to do that and I really had to restrain myself because it's not a blue sky picture. And it felt wrong to paint a blue sky picture. And I also felt that the story isn't finished. So by leaving the gesso raw like that, there is still more in the story. There's still more to go. And an icon should symbolise a story rather than tell it. And so then we get to the big hole in that dummy, which for some people is a bit like, if you're visually empathetic, you can really feel that. And that sort of thinking, and also with her pose, is a bit overextended. She's almost anatomically wrong, but not quite. And that was deliberate. And you'll see that in works of like Goya and Blake, when they draw people, if you look at them, anatomically they're wrong, but emotionally they're right. And you can feel that. And that's kind of where I was trying to go with that. And obviously the hole in her stomach is because that's the street she wants. So the silhouette is the silhouette of Via Sacra, where she actually gave birth. And so that's the hole in her stomach, and that represents her story. And so with icons, what you do is somebody will paint the original icon and everyone will copy that. So Francesca, for my last show, delightfully arranged for all these little children to come in, and we did the outline so they could all colour it in. So there are lots of icons out there of Pope Joan on mum's fridges.
And should we clarify, just for anyone that isn't aware of what gesso is? So essentially it's
yes.
kind of primer, isn't it?
Yes, so it's a technique that dates back to ancient Egypt. And you put gesso on wood, and it's kind of like a surface that you can paint on or you can water gild on. And it's made from whiting and rabbit skin glue.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you. And Black Bowl and Tempera also have a pretty kind of
so the Black Bowl
lineage.
That's like a clay that you use, usually that you put the gold on or the silver on, or usually if it's black, it's silver. But here I use the Black Bowl to make the silhouette because I wanted a really matte, flat black, and I wanted to be able to sand it completely smooth. Around the edges is a yellow bowl, and I've used that to put the gold onto, so you get that beautiful gold kind of metallic. Because with one of the reasons why icons have gold leaf on in this way and are water gilded is because when people started making them, they didn't have electricity. So things are lit with candles. And so the flickering of the candle created light and movement, and that is the spirit of the saint in the piece. So that's why it is.
And I guess there's something, I guess there's an interesting tension between using these things like gesso, which dates back to ancient Egypt, and Black Bowl and Tempera, which date back at least to medieval times, and then using those to create what looks like a very modern image in some ways. Was that part of the appeal of using these sorts of materials?
Absolutely. I mean, there are multiple appeals. On the one hand, because I used to use things like perspex, etc., but I'm also very aware, increasingly aware of, environmental considerations, having to be careful with that. So I like to use materials that, as I've said to friends in the past, like if you threw it in the sea, it would kind of dissolve to nothing. It's all fine. But if you want to keep it, then it will last hundreds of years and it can be conserved. And so things like acrylic paint, very difficult to conserve, but oil paint and tempera and all those things, much easier.
And water gilding, such a beautiful technique, and again, very many centuries old. When did you first encounter it? And could you tell us a little bit about how it works, how you do it?
I think I've always known about water gilding because my mum. So, and you see it, and I'm seeing that kind of like solid gold. And the idea is that you can make things look like solid gold. You can see that in the Point of No Return and on the snail shell. Sorry, what was your question?
Just a little bit about water gilding and how it
The
works.
process of water gilding is you take a piece of wood and you put rabbit skin glue on it. And then depending on what you're doing, sometimes it's a good idea to put a sheet of material down to stop movement. And then you put more layers of gesso. And it can, depending on what you're doing, you can end up with 10, 15 layers of gesso. And the next part of the process is sanding. And so, because when you use a hog hair brush, so you kind of got bumps, which you can't have. So you sand those off, and then you get a cloth, like a linen cloth or a cotton cloth, and you actually polish them off. And you keep polishing, keep polishing, keep polishing. And this is something I do actually sometimes do in my bedroom, talking about my whole life being a studio, and watch movies at the same time because it takes a very long time. And you hold it up against the light, and so you can see the reflection of the window. And when you can see the reflection of the window, and it's, yeah, that's right, then that's when it's polished enough. And if you want to see raw gesso in my work, you can see that in the Dove Moon piece. If you get down and look up, then you can see that. And there's a beautiful, almost ivory quality to it, especially with the layers, because then you get the rings, which I think are rather beautiful. So once you've done that, then you add the bowl, which is a clay and glue. And the idea is that the first layer is strong glue and the glue gets weaker and weaker and weaker as you go up. And then the final piece is you get a squirrel brush, which is kind of like quite wide and very thin. And you get a tiny bit of oil sort of off your face, like really tight. You don't want too much, tiny bit. And then you just place it on the gold, and then you just place it on. Then you hope there's no drafts, and you place it, and then the bowl does this beautiful thing that goes, and it sucks up the gold, and it's rather lovely. And then you have to wait. You have to wait until the right time before you burnish it, because if you burnish it too quickly, you just scuff up all the gold. But if you wait long enough, and the way you know how long to wait is you tap it. So in the olden days, they used to use a wolf's tooth. And I wouldn't like that because I quite like dogs and wolves. But now you can use agate burnishers, which are fabulous. And then you just tap it and you tap it, and it hits a certain pitch. And when it hits that pitch, you know that's when it's ready to burnish. And so then you burnish it, and then you get this beautiful mirror finish.
I read that it takes about 7 years to become competent at it, and then 21 to become a master gilder.
Yeah.
How many years into your journey as a master gilder are you?
About a week and a half. You know, it does take a long time, and some people find it probably easier than others. And I know, and it is a lot about having a very steady hand and all of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Pope Joan is just one of several works in your oeuvre, but also that are present here today that allude to the Abrahamic religions. So Holy Relic, for example, is a crown of hawthorns. I Wish the Hand was Silver, which is that black marionette's hand with those three symbols dangling from it, is another one. The symbols of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. What is it that interests you about religious iconography, and what do you find productive about exploring it in the way that you do?
Well, if we go back to Kate Love, my tutor, and the slight anarchist in there, I like things that are unfashionable. I like things that are slightly uncomfortable. And people feel very uncomfortable with religious subjects. And what you tend to get are extremes. You either get the absolute worship or the anarchist, anybody who believes in God's an idiot kind of extremes. And I think that's a shame, because there is this massive space in the middle, which is really interesting. Because if you think about religion, it kind of dates back so far, and it has always been about almost a moral struggle, like a philosophical moral struggle, and how to do the right thing and how to be better and how to improve. And so in that space, I find it very interesting on the nature of things, because it also shows us the nature of things 2,000 years ago, or less or more or whatever. So I find that element of it interesting. I also find the fact that it's a common language really interesting. So it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Catholic or Muslim, the language is still pretty much the same. And even if you're not those, in most cultures in the world, they are aware of these religions and are kind of comfortable with the ideas behind them. So I have friends, for example, who are painters who, I know about just before COVID, it was quite fashionable to put like logos and stuff into paintings. Well, they're already out of date. Those brands have changed, and the meaning of those brands has changed, but Jesus is still Jesus, you know? And I find that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And just along from that one, there's the metronome, the water-gilded metronome, which is eye-catching and occasionally ear-catching too.
Yes, it's switched off, but it really slowly.
So that one's called Equality. So what is it? Why is it called Equality? Is it the fact that we're kind of all subject to the laws of time, or is there some other kind of reason behind it?
I'm pleased you asked about this piece, and specifically about the name, because this is a piece, if you look at it, and when it is slow, ticking very slowly, and you see your reflection in it and the relevance of that, and then you're twisting the time, it doesn't really make much sense until you know the piece is called Equality. And then that title, it's like a key that unlocks the piece, and the relevance of it ticking really, as you experienced, painfully slowly, because I extend it when it's ticking beyond the point at which it's comfortable, and that can also make the tick not quite perfect, like it go a bit
Irregular.
A bit irregular. Thank you for the word. That was what I was looking for. And so you can also see yourself in the reflection. I think that's useful. And in addition to that, it's water gilded with gold, so you have an understanding of the precious nature of time. And the idea that you have to wind it up to make it even tick. And the idea as well is that you can overwind it, and you can ruin the mechanism inside if you overwind it. But also, if you ruin the mechanism, it can be replaced. And it's not on now, because if we were trying to talk and it was ticking, it would be really annoying. That's also relevant. And when the room is very noisy, you can completely tune it out, and then you can listen for it and you can hear it. So the more you think about it, the more you can understand it. And what I really like about it, with that kind of broader title, Equality, is it takes us to kind of like a fundamental truth, almost like the trunk of the tree rather than the branch of the tree, in terms of the issues for equality. It doesn't matter if it's sexual equality, it doesn't matter if it's racial equality, it doesn't matter if it's homosexual or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. So many of the issues are so similar. And I mean, we're talking about the lectures earlier on before I went to at St Martin's, and they had wonderful lectures about how at the beginning of the abolition of slavery and the suffragette movement, they were absolutely went together. But then for political reasons, they were kind of separated, and it was a great shame, because it weakened the whole fight for everybody. Whereas it would have been better if they kept the same. So I kind of like that anyone who's feeling in some way oppressed or it's not quite right, they can come to the piece and they can see their story in that.
Okay. I mean, this wall alone is full of kind of quite diverse works. And that's one of the pleasing things about your practice, is that the work can take kind of any form and draw on very diverse strands of art history. There's a piece over there called Flying Geisha Girl, which seems to draw on like Japanese woodblock prints, like 19th century prints. So what were you going for with that piece? And could you talk us through kind of what you had in mind?
Well, that piece, when I've just seen hands standing up. So I don't know if you remember the Fukushima 50, when there was that awful, the nuclear issue, power plant, and 50 people stayed behind to manually get water in so we wouldn't have a massive environmental catastrophe. And each one of those people knew that by staying there, they were either going to die quite quickly or quite slowly, but before they were meant to. And they were so graceful about it and so honourable and decent. And I found that quite profound, and I wondered if it had happened in England or America, if the reaction would have been the same, or if they would have behaved that way. And I just thought it was so beautiful, and it affected me quite a lot. And that image came to me in a dream, and it was really quite vivid. And I don't know if any of you have experienced when you dream, when you're willing something to happen. And I had so much anxiety for her that I didn't want her kimono to blow up. I was willing her kimono down. But all that reflected really was my subconscious being worried about her and worried about the 50. And obviously the Hokusai waves are kind of very obviously recognisable. The metal frame, which helps to make you feel like you're in there with her, is a theme I'd used metal frames. You can see it here, and I have other pieces in the past which use a metal frame, so it's something that comes up in my practice. So that's kind of my bit of me being in there. And then with her, I really struggled to get her exactly right. And I kept researching and finding different things. And it's kind of a bit more westernized. And then eventually I found this tiny, like about this big, little Japanese print, 72 DPI, couldn't blow it up, absolute disaster, no artist name or anything on it. And that was the image. And I'd obviously seen it at some point, but I didn't remember seeing it or when I saw it or any of that. And so it kind of helped a bit, but it was so tiny, it didn't help a lot, which is why she's kind of not as faithful to the woodblock print. It's by Suzuki from 1750. And it wasn't until years later that my mum was going through old Sotheby's catalogues, which she'd finally got out of storage because we moved to Australia when I was a kid. So I'd have last seen this catalogue probably when I was about 10 or 11. But somewhere deep in the psyche, it was buried, and it came out in response to that. And if you look closely at her, you can see that actually, so it's a screen print, but she is hand painted white.
Right.
And I've used a pigment ink because then she will change colour differently to the paper. So sometimes she'll look more yellow, significantly more yellow than the paper, and other times less, to do with the light that comes in, whether it's sunlight, etc. So you've kind of got quite a nice dynamic feel about her in that way. And also you'll notice that she has the same toner varnish on that I do. And that's also... So the background, I've created like a grey look by using circles, and that's sort of the rising sun flag sort of idea.
Okay. And is that why you chose to do it as a silkscreen print and not as a, say, a wood block? Is it because of the capabilities of light and what that brings to the piece?
I wanted to do it really big and to do a woodblock print. I have not done, actually I have done a woodblock print now, but I hadn't done a woodblock print at that stage. So yeah, and I just kind of like the idea of doing it with screen printing and a contemporary thing. And what I should also mention, actually quite importantly, I wanted to join East and West in the print. And that's why I put swallows on her obi, so on her belt. And in the East, that is joy and family, because they encourage swallows to come into the eaves of her houses. So all these lovely positive things. In the West, it's a symbol for tattoos, for sailors. And the idea is you sail 5,000 nautical miles, you get a tattoo. Mm-hmm. You sail another 5,000 nautical miles, you get another tattoo. And then you become a professional, like the professionals at the Fukushima. And the really beautiful thing is the poetic thing for me is, if the idea was that if those sailors died at sea and they drowned, that those swallows would pick up their soul and fly into heaven. And I just kind of thought it was an appreciation piece and nothing else.
Okay. As we've said, you work with so many different mediums or media, whatever the accepted plural is. And it reminds me of the phrase, the medium is the message. And I was wondering to what extent that principle applies to your art.
Absolutely, completely. That's a quote from Marshall McLuhan. And it's something I suppose I picked up in consultancy, and this idea that TV isn't always the answer. And in the same way, it's like, well, painting isn't always the answer. And you get a very different feeling, say, for example, from this piece here, when you've got a spider's web made out of human hair. And it becomes not just a spider's web then, it becomes something. And there's the curiosity of how. And then ladders have meanings and everything. So if I'm doing an icon board, it's because it's relevant to the piece, because it's a Pope. So even with this piece here, and somehow you're meant to be perfect, that was actually a process piece, which I used the process because that was the very first icon board I water gilded, is the first one in that series. And it was deliberately the first one because I wanted to use the practice of learning how to water gild as a metaphor for the practice of learning how to become better at life. So, and you can see the different stages, and I don't think we have time now, but I can talk people through it if they're interested.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's also an artwork that you've made specifically for this show that I'd not seen before coming today, and that's called Drift Away, and that's this one here. And so could you talk to us a little bit about the work itself, and particularly the importance of lighting in displaying this and in general in your work?
Well, this piece, I tend to have about, 15, 20 pieces in my head at any one time. And it's a weird process because it's like one in, one out. And unless I make work, I don't have new ideas. So I have to keep making work. And this is a piece I've kind of had in my head, and they sit in your head between 25 and 75% conceived, if that makes sense. And when I saw this space and I knew obviously about lighting, I thought this is probably the perfect time to do it. And it's also a nice way, because it's made specifically for the space, to almost say thank you for exhibiting my work. And so I wanted to do something special for this show, for this space, and also to tie all the works together. In terms of the lighting, it was really lovely to be able to give someone the brief. I'm looking at Matt now, that I want curious and playful, which is an unusual brief, but he straight away got it, and there was no problem for 1 second, and he absolutely understood. And whilst we were doing it, I said, well, what I want is, because then you can, if you fully light it, all the material becomes opaque, which is not what I wanted, because I wanted that drifting. But if you light it the way it's been lit, where it hits the light, it's opaque. Where it doesn't hit the light, it becomes invisible. And therefore you get that much softer, much driftier feel about it. And I asked if you could make it look like a waterfall, and which he did. And we agreed that we didn't want it lit equally on all sides, because we wanted to make it feel more dynamic. It would have been very easy to make it feel like a box, but that would have been entirely wrong for the piece. So it was really lovely to work with someone who knew exactly what they were doing, could just go, and also the lights have these amazing abilities to like bend and stuff, which I don't understand, but they were great. And I learned a lot about lighting just through the process of lighting here and the other options. So poor Francesca, polishing walls, I'm a nightmare now forever.
I think we've got time for one more question before we throw it open to the floor. So I just want to ask you how you might sum up the ways in which your practice has evolved since you began, and what are some of the what are some of the more unexpected turns it's taken?
Well, I started off, as we mentioned, quite deliberate about neuroscience. That has softened so much, but it's still there, and it is very much a tool. I've also started using poetry as a form of sketching, to sketch out ideas and to process and work with ideas. And that is sort of revving up and becoming bigger. But it will be a tool. With poetry, so with neuroscience, it's more like a paintbrush. With poetry, sometimes it's a paintbrush, sometimes it's a paint. It is doing more. So that's ways in which it's developed. The other thing that was surprising was how much feminist work I ended up making, because I hadn't seen myself as a feminist until I became an artist. And because my work is about reacting to what's around me, there are quite a lot of issues for women in art. So it's kind of triggered the feminism within.